Hello and welcome, dear friends. Today we are going to discuss postmodernism. Almost all the literary theorists and critics who have written about postmodernism have admitted that postmodernism cannot be defined in any concise manner. The reason for this, as Simon Malpass states, is that defining presupposes rationality, logic, clarity, and precision. And postmodernism often seeks to grasp what escapes these processes of definition and celebrates what resists or disrupts them. Nevertheless, some who have tried to define postmodernism, such as Hans Burtons, Stephen Seidman, Jean Baudrillard, Fredric Jameson, Gianfranco Lyotard, have circumscribed it within limited frames as a concept, practice, style, or moment, with differing theoretical affiliations and cultural manifestations. In spite of the bewildering variety and confusing divergences that characterize it, postmodernism has been in wide circulation and has steadily permeated all branches of knowledge and artistic disciplines: philosophy, history, sociology, anthropology, architecture, music, literature, and film. Some believe that it's already on the way out. Malcolm Bradbury and Richard Ruland, for example, have stated that postmodernism looks like a stylistic phase that ran from 1960s to the 1980s. Whatever has been written after that falls within postmodernism. This lecture has 5 objectives. 1. To study the rise of postmodernism in the field of architecture and art. 2. Its spread into the fields of literature and its new edges of complexity. 3. The postmodern theory of Lyotard. 4. The influence of Baudrillard on postmodern culture. And 5. The views of Jameson on postmodernism. Tracing the rise of postmodernism is an exciting exercise that also helps in making sense of its varied meanings and conceptualizations and its growing influence within various arts and academic disciplines. Many art and culture historians have traced its beginnings to the 1950s, when it was used by Jane Jacobs and Robert Venturin in the field of architecture to cure it of the unhealthy purism of modernism and to rehumanize it. It is because the modernist architecture had ceased to be the avant-garde that it was in 1920s and 1930s and had already become part of the establishment of an exclusive class of greedy men. They used technology to create huge structures of sameness that dictated a lifestyle for the masses, which was like an imposition of a strict and systematic order that only brutalized them. Postmodernists reject the attitude of the modernists towards technology that revels in sameness and pleads for plurality, which Venturi describes in a colorful language. Architects can no longer afford to be intimidated by the puritanically moral language of orthodox modern architecture. I like elements that are hybrid rather than pure, compromising rather than clean, distorted rather than straightforward, ambiguous rather than articulated. Thus, in its early phase, postmodernism rejected the monumental formalism of high modernism as well as its anti-representational self-reflexivity, which led to a shift towards pictorial narrative and stimulated new kinds of representational practices. This was quite visible in the world of art, cinema, and literature. In postmodern art, as pointed out by Colin Trott, the high culture and elitism of modernism is countered by artists by using techniques and technologies from the field of mass media, especially to articulate the desires and aspirations of people who were marginalized within modernism. Some artists also expose its major interests and values, The artists also used techniques like the montage to deal with the new consumption culture. In the world of literature, postmodernism broke the elitism of the modernist mold by changing the very nature of the experimentation that had once been the strength of modernism. The shrinking space of modernist literature expanded to include the works of writers who had been pushed to the margins. The gulf between what was called the serious or canonical literature and popular literature that had become too prominent during the times of high modernism was bridged. Since going back into past had become a general practice in almost all arts, writers took extraordinary interest in engaging themselves with the past in multiple ways to create engaging narratives. In many ways, literature also turned global. In America, postmodernism permeated the spirit of the phenomenon of the counterculture, which strengthened the democratic, the humanistic, and the eclectic, both in creative and critical writings, in the world of novelists like Kurt Vonnegut and Ken Kesey and critics like Leslie Fiedler. In the 1970s and 1980s, postmodernism acquired new edges of complexity when it entered the post-structuralist and Foucauldian orbits, respectively. In the first one, it got connected with Derrida, deconstruction, and language, in which the objectively rational and self-determined subject of modernity gave way to a postmodernist subject who, as Burton puts it, is determined within and constituted by language. In the second one, postmodernism absorbed the ideas of Foucault related to cultural institutions and power and established links with marginal discourses, ethnicity, multiculturalism, and feminism. These differing theoretical and philosophical affiliations spread its range and influence, making it a truly global phenomenon, which Burton describes as a complex of artistic strategies and as a loosely coherent set of theoretical assumptions, as a sign of the times, as emblematic of the cultural shift of epistemic proportions. Several theoreticians of differing persuasions contributed to the growth, spread, and also the complexity of postmodernism. Jean Lyotard's influential work, The Postmodern Condition, presents the condition of knowledge in the most highly developed societies. His main argument, in his own words, is that the status of knowledge is altered as societies enter what is known as the post-industrial age and cultures enter what is known as the postmodern age. He explains this by positing a distinction between what he calls narrative knowledge and scientific knowledge. Because narrative knowledge seeks legitimation through storytelling, science always belittled it by poking fun at it. Scientists claimed universality for their knowledge, and because of that, a measure of authority that narrative knowledge could not even hope to attain. Lyotard disputes this claim of the scientists by stating that science too has used narratives to legitimize itself, and these he calls grand narratives about knowledge and include the Enlightenment narrative of progress and human liberation, the Hegelian narrative of the manifestation of scientific reason, the Marxian narrative of revolution that ends up in classless society, and the Freudian narrative that promises release from unconscious trauma. Lyotard believes that all these grand narratives have not borne their promise, and this leads him to his oft-quoted definition of the postmodern. I define postmodernism as incredulity towards meta-narratives. Because of the failure of these narratives, Lyotard thinks that knowledge has to seek legitimacy through local narratives and not through universal ones. and these he calls little narratives or first-order narratives, which are self-legitimizing. They, in his own words, define what has the right to be said and done in the culture in question, and since they are themselves a part of that culture, they are legitimated by the simple fact that they do what they do. Lyotard's dissatisfaction with the grand narratives is because of two reasons. One, by nature they are tyrannical and impose a universality on events and actions which is false. Two, their intent is not as much to seek truth as to attain power. In his own words, scientists, technicians, and instruments are purchased not to find truth but to augment power. Little narratives overcome these problems by accepting that knowledge is fragmented and partial, and the differences are natural and need to be recognized. Because of this, such narratives enable individuals to escape from the terror-like grip of the grand narratives and give them freedom to create their own narratives. In this way, the little narratives are realistic and liberating. By recognizing difference, postmodernism celebrates heterogeneity and pluralism and encourages creativity and innovation. This has a healthy impact on literary creations and historical recreations, particularly of the ones about the subjugated and the marginalized. Another thinker who had a profound influence on postmodern culture is Jean Baudrillard. In some ways, he is like Lyotard, for he too is anti-foundational. But he draws attention to the effect of the pervasive use of technology, which has a serious impact on issues related to representation. Earlier on, even during the era of modernity, there was a discernible and thus understandable connection between signs and objects. That is, systems of signification were rooted in some material foundation, something that was called real. In the postmodern condition, this has changed because the media has reached a high level of saturation in which the concrete material foundation signified by the signs is not there. Now there are only representations, mere simulations of concrete reality. To put it in a perspective, Tim Wood suggests that Baudrillard's postmodernity is founded on three ideas: simulation, implosion, and hyperreality. Baudrillard considers the postmodern era as one of simulations which are governed by what Wood calls information science and a new cybernetic technology. In simulations, the distinction between the model and reality is eroded. In fact, the image or the model becomes more real than the real. The image or simulation and reality implodes, and the experience of the real world disappears. Baudrillard sees the movement of simulation in history in three phases. A, from the times of Renaissance to the times of Industrial Revolution, signs reflect reality and then distort them. B, during the Industrial Age, signs disguise the absence of reality. C, and in the postmodern times, signs no longer have any bearing on reality. So during postmodern times, when models of a real have no origin or reality, then the distinction between the real and the unreal becomes so blurred that the word hyperreal is used to signify more than real. When the distinction between objects and their representation is dissolved, then one is left only with simulacra. When the simulacra invade more and more aspects of social reality and virtually take over the real itself, then we get the world of simulacra without reference. In a revealing passage, Baudrillard makes us see its effect on us, and I quote, "If one thinks about it, People no longer project themselves into their objects with their effects and their representations, their fantasies of possession, loss, mourning, jealousy. The psychological dimension has, in a sense, vanished, and even if it can be marked out in detail, one feels that it's not really there, but things are being played out. Apart from the social consequences of this state of affairs, in which possibilities of social change are virtually closed, it has consequences for the relationship between art forms and reality as well. When people watch films, then they see the world around them like a film with almost an air of unreality to it. The TV, in his view, embodies it more tellingly. Because of the dissolution of TV into life, the dissolution of life into TV. Thus, the world turns into a world of simulacra where there are no reference. In his own words, there are only signs without reference, empty, senseless, absurd, and elliptical signs. Another theoretician, Fredric Jameson, believes that postmodernism is actually a reaction to high modernism. And because modernism has several varieties of established forms, there are different kinds of postmodernisms which embrace all the arts, specimens of which he catalogues in the very opening paragraph of his essay, Postmodernism and Consumer Society. And then he moves on to look at their different features. The first major feature is what he calls the effacement in it of some key boundaries or separations. These include the removal of separation between high culture and so-called mass or popular culture. The kind of differentiation that the modernists made between elite culture and the culture that feeds on TV serials and popular reading is changed drastically in this new setup. Because of this, the popular writings get incorporated in serious writings in such a way that the line between high art and commercial forms seems increasingly difficult to draw. Almost in a similar manner, postmodernism marks what Jameson calls effacement of the older categories of genre and discourse. Before postmodern times, there was an understandable distinction between philosophy and other academic disciplines such as political science, sociology, literary criticism, etc. But now there is only theory, which is all or none of these things at once. Jameson explains it with the example of Foucault, about whose work nobody can say with certainty whether it can be called history, philosophy, social theory, or political science, or what. Jameson also says that though there is a tendency to equate postmodernism with a variety of style, it is also a periodizing concept, for it correlates with the emergence of a new type of social life and new economic order, the consumer society, the society of the media, and the society of multinational capitalism. And then Jameson dwells on the two features of this social and economic order which are meant to be its negative aspects, pastiche and schizophrenia. He clarifies that pastiche is different from parody, though both involve the imitations of other styles. In parody, the intention is to mock the original style, but in pastiche there is no such intention, for he says that it is a neutral practice of such mimicry without parody's ulterior motive, without the satirical impulse, without laughter, without that still latent feeling that there exists something normal compared to which what is being imitated is rather comic. Jameson considers pastiche a dominant mode of postmodernism because the old individual or individual subject is dead, killed by corporate capitalism. Because of this, there is no possibility of any new individual styles to come into being. So, artists and writers can only imitate dead styles, to speak through the masks and with the voices of the styles in the imaginary museum. This he calls the failure of art and the aesthetic, the failure of the new, the imprisonment in the past. The imprisonment of the past is reflected in imitations of the style of the past, in films as well as in literary productions. Pastiche could also be more than reinventing a picture of the past, for reinventing the feel and shape of an older period, as for example in the film Star Wars. Jameson also says that E.L. Doctorow's novels like The Ragtime or Loon Lake are actually pastiche and not historical novels, though they might look like them. For the historical past is represented through historical stereotypes. Another feature of postmodern culture is schizophrenia, which, taking a cue from Lacan, he calls a language disorder and not to be connected with any psychic disorder. It points to the breakdown of relationship between signifiers. This schizophrenia experience is an experience of isolated, disconnected, discontinuous material signifiers which fail to link up into a coherent sequence, which results in the loss of meaning. With the help of several poems, he illustrates how even representations that look realistic are not actually realistic, for they do not represent the outside world, but only the photograph of the outside world, which he calls photorealism or false realism. The reality that they seek to capture is only a series of images, making it into a reality of images, and the perpetuation of time into a series of perpetual present. This has serious implications both for literary creations as well as in the making of historical works, to which we will come later. Although Jameson brings out some of the changes that have prominently been associated with postmodernism, he is critical of the concept. In this, he is joined by several others like Habermas and Terry Eagleton. Habermas is of the view that modernity has not ended yet, and it is truly democratic and liberating in its spirit. He is also critical of the relativism that postmodernism celebrates. The very title of Eagleton's book, The Illusions of Postmodernism, indicates that much of what he finds in postmodernism is more of an illusion than a reality. In spite of these criticisms of postmodernism, some literary critics, and Lyndia Hutcheon in particular, consider postmodernism enabling and with a rich potential for interesting and meaningful literary creations. Since she has 3 volumes on the subject, A Poetics of Postmodernism, B, The Politics of Postmodernism, and lastly, Canadian Postmodernism, it's proper to know what she has to say. Hutcheon says that instead of tying postmodernism to any fixities, it is better to consider it an ongoing cultural activity which can be studied best by evolving its poetics, which is an open, ever-changing theoretical structure by which to order both our cultural knowledge and our critical procedures. And this should include art and a theory about art. And she builds this poetics on the basis of films, videos, photography, painting, dance, music, and other literary genres. She is conscious of the contradictory nature of postmodernism, which, in her words, uses and abuses, installs, and then subverts the very concepts it challenges. It is seriously engaged with what she calls the presence of the past, which it seeks to revisit critically by entering into an ironical dialogue with the past of both art and society. and since it works within the very system that it seeks to subvert, it struggles to bring into being something new. Probably the most prominent feature of Hutchian's poetics is that among the various literary forms, it privileges the genre of the novel and calls it historiographic metafiction. She admits that such novels are self-reflexive, yet, and paradoxically, they lay claim to historical events and personages. She disagrees with Jameson, who says that because the postmodernist culture is characterized by pastiche and schizophrenia, and societies are what he says incapable of dealing with time and history. Works that deal with past lack depth and evince no signs of historical consciousness. Postmodernism, according to her, will result in, number one, borders of literary genres will become fluid. 2, parody will emerge as a perfect postmodern form. 3, traditional notions of perspective in narratives will change. 4, historical narrativity and closure will be contested but from within. And 5, the local and the regional will be stressed in the face of mass culture. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Hope you have understood it well. We shall meet again with a new topic. Until then, take very good care of yourself, and thank you for watching.